Before we get into that, I remind you that there's vision, and this is what this is. It's a vision from the Lord to Daniel. It starts back in chapter 10 and goes all the way through chapter 12. And it's one vision. And it tells us the history of Daniel's time all the way to the end of the tribulation period. That's a long history because we haven't reached the end of the tribulation yet. In the middle of this vision is a revealing of the king of the north that we're going to talk about tonight, whose name is Antiochus Epiphanes. So far in this chapter, we've seen a blow-by-blow account of the battles between the north and the southern kingdoms in chapter 11. And I encourage you again, if you've go on our website, look at the YouTube, look at those, because even though you might have been here to hear it, I guarantee you that you didn't get everything that was in there. There's a lot of historical information that was presented to you about these battles. And if you go through and listen and read it verse by verse with what I had to say, you're going to see some amazing things in the Word of God. These battles that were taking place between the north and the south are divisions of Alexander the Great's empire. When he died, his empire was divided into 4 generals, and only 2 of them had any real prominence. The north were the Seleucids, that was his general Seleucid, and in the south was where Egypt was, and that's the Ptolemies, or the general Ptolemy that controlled that. They fought back and forth for centuries. The Syria area in the north and the Egyptian area in the south. And guess who's stuck right in the middle? Israel. And so this is a part of what God predicted would be the indignation for Israel. Not only then, but throughout all history, they were going to be persecuted by those neighbors around them. And at the end of these battles, we have now a king that we're going to see tonight called the Abomination of Desolation. He becomes a historical person of the past that reminds us and the Jews that there will be another man like him who in the Bible is called the Antichrist. And we will talk about him next week. He will make a covenant, Antiochus, with them as well. He will also be an abomination of desolation, just like the Antichrist will. And Antiochus, so he reigned from 175 BC to 164 BC. Now his deception, we're going to start with his character in verse number 21. And in his estate shall stand up a vile person, to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. This vile man, notice what it said there. He is a vile character, vile person. And in fact, he is so wicked that it's hard for me to describe him to you. He was the younger son of Antiochus the Great, which we talked about last time. He was given up to the most degrading and unnatural passions. I could guess that's a good word for it, passions. He was unscrupulous. He was cruel. He was of a savage nature. This is a man that you wouldn't want to be around at all. He took the title Theos Epiphanes, which means God in the flesh. And that's blasphemy, because we know that Jesus Christ is God in the flesh, as was pointed out earlier today in John chapter 1. I believe that was probably Brother Henry's class, or maybe, I can't remember, doesn't matter. In verse 1, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Now look at verse 14. And the Word was made flesh. God was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory as of the glory of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. One more, and then we'll go on. 1 Timothy chapter 3. Because I really like this verse as far as You can't argue with it. That's the point. Our Jehovah Witness friends that come to your door and knock on the door, they say Jesus is a God. He is not the God. He is a created being. Well, I'm here to tell you that cannot possibly be, because when you read 1 John 1:1, it goes on to says, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. So that goes to show you that he can't be a created being if he made all things. And in chapter 3 of 1 Timothy, verse 16, and without controversy, and I always like to stop right there and point out, it should not be controversial, but it is. Great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the Spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. That can't be referring to the Father. It can only be referring to the Son, Jesus Christ. So the point is that he is God in the flesh. And of course, we know that he's called in Matthew 1:23, he should be called Emmanuel, which being interpreted is God with us. Now, people said that this guy, Antiochus, was so vile that those around him called him Epimanes instead of Epiphanes, which means madman or lunatic. And I'm sure he probably was. Going back to chapter 11 and look at verse 21 again. And it says, and in his estate shall stand up a vile person to whom they shall not give the honor of the kingdom, but he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. Now, they're not going to give him the honor of the kingdom. In other words, he had no legitimate claim to the throne. He is the brother of the late king, and the throne should have gone to his nephew Demetrius. And he shall come in peaceably and obtain the kingdom by flatteries. So basically what he did is he did some political maneuvering and deception, and then he gained the throne. No fighting was involved. He just tricked him into getting that his way. And in the conflicts, in verse number 22, and with the arms of a flood shall they be overthrown before him, and shall be broken, yea, also the prince of the covenant. So according to history, Antiochus' forces routed the forces of Egypt in 170 BC. The prince of the covenant here is a reference to the high priest at the time, who was Onias III. He was deposed and later murdered, by the way. And he was replaced by his brother Jason, along with Antiochus' encouragement. He then, who wanted Greek culture to be established in Israel. So by the time Jesus came, guess what? Greek culture was established in Israel. In fact, cities were named with Greek names. Decapolis, Capernaum, all those are Greek names. And I can go on, but notice his craftiness in verse 23. And after the league made with him, he shall work deceitfully, for he shall come up and shall become strong with a small people. He shall enter peaceably, even upon the fattest places of the province, and he shall do that which his fathers have not done, nor his fathers' fathers. He shall scatter among them the prey, and spoil, and riches, yea, and he shall forecast his devices against the strongholds, even for a time. So Antiochus Epiphanes adopted a policy of friendship with Egypt. And he pretended to support one of his nephews, who was Ptolemy Philometor, against another of his nephews, who was called Ptolemy Euergetes. And all this was just to cover his and to advance his interests. He even managed to have himself crowned king of the Egyptian city of Memphis after he had captured Ptolemy Philometor. He, according to this verse, greatly plundered, greatly conquered the lands, but he differed from his father and his father's fathers. How? Because he did something that they never did. He took to distributing those spoils that he took among the people. And when you give the people free things, generally they're going to be favorable toward you. And so he won their support by giving them all this stuff. He also kept a strong garrison on the border of Egypt so that his entry into Egypt could be at any time he wanted and be unobstructed. Now let's go back and look at verse 25 at the destruction of Egypt and his attack on them. It says in verse 25, "And he shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south," that's Egypt, "with a great army. And the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with very great and mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall forecast devices against him." So in 170 BC, Antiochus' army was victorious over the southern kingdom, over Ptolemy Philometor's larger Egyptian army. It was a larger army. And in verse 26 then, it says, "Yea, and they that feed of the portion of his meat shall destroy him, and his army shall overflow, and many shall fall down slain." So Antiochus was victorious in part because Ptolemy's counselors plotted against him. It's one thing, the governments back then, you couldn't even trust you, even those close to you. So in verse 27 it says, "And both these kings' hearts shall do mischief, and they shall speak lies at one table, but it shall not prosper, for yet the end shall be at the time appointed." So the two kings here are Antiochus Epiphanes and Ptolemy Philometor. They worked together to overcome Ptolemy's brother, Ptolemy Physcon. He took the throne from his brother and captured him. And they were more interested in their own interests, according to this verse. And so they told lies, according to this verse, that they thought the other would want to hear and be deceived by. And so the desolation of Israel then happens after this by Antiochus. Verse 28. "Then shall he return unto his land with great riches, and his heart shall be against the holy covenant. He shall do exploits and return to his own land." So here's Antiochus' attitude toward the holy covenant. He returned to Egypt loaded with Egyptian treasure, and he marched through Judea only to discover that while he was down in Egypt, an insurrection had happened up in Israel. Jason, who was Aeneas' the third brother, who was killed under pressure from the Jewish people because they had heard that Antiochus had died down there, they made an attack against the Seleucids in Jerusalem because of this false report. Well, when Antiochus then heard of this as on his way back north, how the people had rejoiced in his death, which they did, he led an attack on Jerusalem and killed 40,000 Jews, slaughtered them, and sold at least that many as slaves. He also plundered the temple, carrying off treasures that were valued at 1,800 talents. And then after venting his anger on the Jews, he returned to Antioch in Syria. So Antiochus attempted then to invade Egypt once again, verse 29 of Daniel 11. "At the time appointed, he shall return and come toward the south, but it shall not be as the former or as the latter." I thought this is pretty interesting. In the spring of 168 BC, Antiochus again led his troops to Egypt in order to put down the two Ptolemy brothers who had reconciled. They were at each other. Now they're reconciled. This time, though, he is not successful, as the Bible said, because the Ptolemy brothers had also appealed to Rome for help. And their appeal was heard by Rome. And so then Antiochus then was angered and took out that anger against Israel again. Verse 30. For the ships of Chittim shall come against him. Therefore he shall be grieved and return and have indignation against the holy covenant. So shall he do. He shall even return and have intelligence with them that forsook thy holy covenant. So Rome sent ships from Cyprus to meet up with Antiochus 4 miles out of Alexandria, Egypt. Papalius Laenus, I don't know if I said his name right, he commanded the Roman ships. He was the commander of those ships. And he put into the hands of Antiochus a demand. And it was a demand from the Roman Senate, by the way. And that any further aggression on his part against the south was to stop. And having read it, Antiochus then said he would have to call his advisors and consult with them as to what was to be done. Well, Papalius, he took a staff, drew a circle around Antiochus, and said, you'll make your decision before you step out of the circle. And so he did. He agreed with what he said. He then returned home by the way of Judea and was, as the Bible said, was very upset, very angry. He took his angers out on the Jews once more. And he did spare those who forsook the covenant, though. He killed thousands again and destroyed the temple, which wasn't rebuilt again until Herod the Great, right before the time of Jesus. Now, look at his abomination in verse number 31. And arms shall stand up on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of the strength, and shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. So when Antiochus heard what we find here, these armed forces of Antiochus, I should say, became guards of the temple area. And his next step was to discontinue regular service, worship service on the Sabbath. And they chose the Sabbath day then to attack and kill multitudes. And he made heathen idolatry mandatory. In fact, he required the Greeks and their culture to be practiced by the Jews. And in order to enforce this, he had pigs sacrificed on the altar to pagan gods. And he made the Jews do it. He then erected an image of Zeus on the altar, the brazen altar. So Antiochus then attacks the Jewish people in verse 32. It says, and such as do wickedly against the covenant shall be he corrupt by flatteries, but the people that do know their God shall be strong and do exploits. And they that understand among the people shall instruct many. Yea, they shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, by spoil, many days. Now when they shall fall, they shall be helped with a little help, but many shall cleave to them with flatteries. And some of them of understanding shall fall, to try them, to purge and to make them white, even to the time of the end, because it is yet for a time appointed. So some Jews, obviously, according to this passage, compromised, and some remained true to God, just like it is in our day and age, amen? So there's a group of Jews that were called the Hassadines, who stood for the law and taught the people what the law said, in spite of what was going on. And those who resisted Antiochus were severely persecuted, according to our passage. And the leader of these people that were resistant was named Judas Maccabees. And by the way, the books of the Maccabean books, they're not inspired, but they are a good historical reference to this time. So don't be afraid to read them if you get a hold of them. He led the revolt against Antiochus from 168 to 165 BC. So it's not a little war. It took 3 years for this to happen. His revolt was helped with a little, but only a temporary respite from the Syrian persecution. God allowed his people to be persecuted for one reason. The Bible tells me, to purge and to make them white. He wanted his people purified from sin like metal is refined from impurities. And nothing drives people to their knees like suffering. That's what it's in for. That's why James said in James chapter 1, and verse number 2, "My brethren, count it all joy when you fall into divers temptations, knowing this, that the trying of your faith worketh patience." That's why we should rejoice, because God is helping us to grow. So Daniel received a complete revelation from God concerning the future suffering of the Jewish people. Notice what it said, even to the time of the end. You understand that time hasn't happened yet. They would suffer, and Daniel pointed it out. They would suffer through the Persian Empire. They did. They would suffer through the Greek Empire. They did. They would suffer through the Roman empires. They did. And they would continue to suffer through the time of the Roman revived empire. And they will. And its ruler, the Antichrist, whom we'll talk about next week. All right. Anybody got any questions? I don't normally do this, but I will. Yeah, Brother Henry.